In this video, we are going to talk about adding and subtracting fractions. So let's begin with adding. Let's say we were given the problem 2 3/4 plus 1/6. Now, I tell my students that you never want to begin an addition or subtraction problem horizontally. I'm going to go ahead and set it up vertically. So it is 2 3/4 plus 1/6. Notice that I've lined it up by place value. So I have my whole numbers, which is 2 and nothing, and my fractions 3/4 and 1/6. Now you can add by place value. You could add your whole numbers first, find your common denominator, and add your fractions. But the way that we do it to ensure that there is less error throughout is we go ahead, because what we're used to with division and multiplication is converting everything first. We're going to keep that same rule with addition and subtraction. It also, when we go to subtract, prevents us from ever having to regroup with subtraction. So looking at 2 3/4 and 1/6, I know that I cannot add these two fractions because I'm not adding a common unit. I don't have the same denominator. I'm adding fourths to sixths, which I cannot do. So what I need to do is find a greatest common multiple, and that becomes my common denominator. But again, before I begin, I'm going to go ahead and convert these. So of course 1/6 is going to stay the same. 2 3/4 becomes 4 times 2 is 8, plus 3 is 11/4. All right, so now I have a fraction plus a fraction. However, I still cannot add these fractions because I don't have a common denominator. So in order to find it, I could either come to the side and list the multiples of 4 and 6. Multiples are like skip counting. So 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24. And I could keep going that way. So 6, 12, 18, 24. And I could say, oh, okay, well, I see two different numbers. I see 12 and I see 24. I want to find, I think I said earlier, greatest common multiple. You want to find your least common multiple. So in this case, if you start from the left, the least common multiple that they have, the least multiple, the multiple that they have in common, the lowest multiple they have in common is 12. The reason we choose the lowest is because it prevents us from having to simplify really big numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and choose 12. Now, a faster way to choose a common denominator is simply to multiply your denominator. So 6 times 4, just like that, you can know, okay, well, a common denominator is 24, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. Now, either is fine. Some students can look at the numbers and know right out off the top of their head, okay, 12 is going to work for both of these numbers. There is nothing wrong with this. It just takes a little bit longer. And as you can see, again, if you multiplied 6 times 4, you would get 24, which is a common multiple. It's just not the least or the lowest common multiple. So we're going to go with 12. So in order to create, essentially what we're doing is we're creating equivalent fractions. I needed a fraction that is equivalent to 1/6 in twelfths and a fraction that is equivalent to 11/4 in twelfths. So in order to do that, I have to ask myself, how did I get from 6 to 12? All right, well, I know that 6 times 2 is 12. So if I did that to my denominator, I have to do the same thing to my numerator. So 1 times 2 is 2, and what I've done is just made an equivalent fraction. So 1/6 is equivalent or the same as 2/12. Same thing here. How did I get from 4 to 12? I multiplied by 3, so that's what I will do here, and I will get 33. So at this point in the process, I am now adding common denominators. I have twelfths and twelfths, so I know that I am now ready to add. I wasn't ready here and I wasn't ready here, but now I'm ready. So we want to make sure that our denominator stays consistent throughout. So it's 12 here, 12 here. It's going to be 12 in my sum or my answer as well. So my denominator stays the same, and I add the parts or my numerator. So 33 and 2 is what I add, and I know that that's 35. So the sum or the answer to 2 3/4 plus 1/6 is 35/12, which is the same. I could either, again, come over and divide, or I could know that 12 times 3 is 36. That's too high, so it's going to go in 2 times, and you are going to have 11 parts remaining out of the 12. So my answer is 2 and 11/12. And it's always important to look at your equation and ask yourself, okay, does that make sense? Does it make sense that if I added 2 wholes to no wholes, and instead just 1/6, I could estimate that my sum would be around 2, almost to 3. Okay, well look what I have here. I have 2 holes and I have almost another hole. I'm almost at 3, but not quite. So this sum, my answer here, I can feel confident about this answer because when I think reasonably about what it is that I'm doing, this is a reasonable answer. So that is addition. Like every operation, you want to make sure that they are first in fraction form, not a mixed number. So I converted. So we have an improper fraction and a proper fraction, 2 fractions. And before I begin to add, I have to make sure that I have a common denominator. So you can find that by multiplying your denominators and getting 24. It's not always going to be the least common multiple, but it still works. And then or you could list your multiples and choose your least common multiple, which is what we've done here. So that is addition. Now with subtraction, just like subtracting whole numbers, borrowing and regrouping, that is still there with subtracting fractions. You still do that when you subtract fractions. Now I'm just going to show you just so you can see what that looks like, but we're not actually going to learn it that way. Let's say we have 2 1/3 minus 1/2. All right, so I'm going to set it up vertically. Now, when solving this problem, there are a couple things you would need to know. The first being is that 1/2 is 50%, which is bigger than 1/3, which is 33%. So that tells me that I can't take 1/2 from 1/3 because 1/2 is bigger. This is just like when you're subtracting whole numbers. Let's say I had this. I can't take 9 from 8 because 9 is bigger. That's what's happening here. I can't take 1/2 from 1/3 because 1/2 is bigger. So what regrouping looks like with adding or subtracting by place value is like this. So I have to take a whole from the 2, which makes it a 1. And the whole that I just took from the 2, I have to give it to my fraction. So really what I did by taking a whole is I took 3/3, which is equivalent to a whole, and I'm going to give it to this 1/3. So my 2 becomes a 1, and my 1/3 is going to become 4/3 because I gave my 1/3 the 3/3. So now 4/3 is bigger than 1/3, and I can subtract by place value once I would have found common denominators. So let's use 6 times 3 times 3 times 2 times 2. Okay, so I can subtract whole number by whole number. That gives me 1. Now my denominator stays the same. It is 6. And my numerator, 8 minus 3, is 5. So I get the answer of 1 5/6. Now the reason we try to avoid this, now of course if it makes sense to a student, it's perfectly fine. But the tricky part is that sometimes we go ahead and get started not realizing that this second number right here is actually bigger. And if you don't realize that and you don't regroup, then your answer will be incorrect. So I'm going to leave the answer right there that we just found with subtracting by place value. And I'm going to show us what it looks like if we were to subtract by conversion. So 2 1/3 minus 1/2. So this fraction is going to stay the same because remember I want to have fraction and fraction. So fraction stays. Mixed number becomes an improper fraction. 3 times 2 is 6 plus 1 is 7/3. All right. When I subtract by converting, I will never have to regroup, which is the beautiful part about it. So now I do it just like I do division. Got to find a common denominator, so I'm going to use 6. How did I get from 2 to 6? Well, I multiplied by 3. How did I get from 3 to 6? I multiplied by 2. Now, it's really important, if we're working too fast, it's hard, or it can slip our mind to actually pay attention to the operation we're being asked to do. So we will all, at this point, when we're ready to either add or subtract because we have those common denominators, we want to look and see what we're being asked. So I'm being asked to subtract. So again, my denominator stays the same. 14 minus 3 is 11, and 11/6 is equivalent or the same as 1 5/6, which you see matches the problem or the solution that we got when we subtracted by place value. So either way, however, the way that they are encouraged to solve it is with conversion first, because you can see that you don't have to deal with the regrouping. So the rule with addition and subtraction is convert first. You have to find a common denominator, because when you add or subtract, your units or your denominators, what it is that you're adding or subtracting, has to be the same. And then you solve as normal, paying attention to the operation. If you get that improper fraction, you always convert to a mixed number.